Imagine opening a book so strange that every page feels like evidence from a world parallel to our own. The plants do not match known botany. The script does not belong to any accepted language. The diagrams seem familiar for 1 second and impossible the next. Nude figures drift through green liquid in bizarre star charts like people inside a coded dream. This is the Voynich Manuscript, one of the most famous unsolved books in history. For more than a century, cryptographers, linguists, historians, intelligence analysts, and curious amateurs have tried to force it to confess what it is. A secret manual. A medical text. A hoax. A cipher. A lost language. A ritual book. Nothing has ended the argument. The manuscript remains trapped in a rare category of mystery, physically real, intensively studied, and still capable of making experts look at the same page and walk away with different worlds in their heads. The known history of the book is strange enough before anyone opens it. The manuscript is named after Wilfrid Voynich, the Polish-Lithuanian book dealer who acquired it in 1912 from the Jesuit order at the Villa Mondragone near Rome. Voynich quickly realized he had stumbled onto something extraordinary. The book was written on vellum, beautifully organized, and clearly intentional rather than random, yet no one around him could identify the script or explain the illustrations. Voynich was not a scholar of meaningless curiosities. He was a dealer in rare books and manuscripts, and he understood when an object belonged to a lost intellectual world. The more he showed it to specialists, the stranger the reaction became. People did not merely fail to read it. They failed to classify it. That is one reason the Voynich manuscript still exerts such force. It resists even the first layer of order historians usually apply to old objects. For years, the manuscript's origin was debated wildly. Some thought it might be medieval. Others suspected an early modern forgery designed to deceive a collector. The speculation was so broad that it sometimes became almost useless. Then scientific testing narrowed one crucial part of the mystery. Radiocarbon dating of the vellum placed it in the early 15th century, around 1404 to 1438. That result mattered enormously. It did not tell us who wrote the text, what it says, or why it was made. But it strongly suggested the parchment itself was genuinely old, not a modern fake built to exploit later collectors. A forger could, in theory, write nonsense on old vellum, but the dating shifted the burden of proof. The manuscript was no longer easy to dismiss as a recent joke. It belonged in the late medieval world, and that meant the puzzle had to be taken more seriously. Physically, the Voynich manuscript looks like a coherent book created according to some internal plan. It contains roughly 200 surviving folios, though scholars suspect that some pages are missing. The text is written from left to right in a smooth, consistent hand or hands using an unknown script now commonly called Voynichese. The illustrations seem to divide the manuscript into thematic sections. There are pages filled with strange plants. Circular diagrams associated with astronomy or astrology. Dense text pages marked by star-like labels. Complex biological or bathing scenes with female figures connected by green pipes or pools. Pharmaceutical-style pages with jars, roots, and plant fragments. And finally, text-heavy sections that look almost recipe-like in format. This internal structure is one of the strongest arguments against pure randomness. The manuscript behaves like a book with purpose, even if the purpose remains hidden. The botanical section is where many people first lose their footing. At a glance, some plants look vaguely medieval, as though they might correspond to herbal traditions common in Europe. But closer inspection makes confidence collapse. Leaves belong to one species, roots to another, flowers to something else entirely, and in many cases the composite still fails to resolve into any known plant at all. That has produced one of the oldest debates around the manuscript. Are these real plants drawn badly? Stylized plants copied through generations of illustration. Deliberately altered plants meant to hide their identity. Or pure inventions assembled from fragments of the natural world. Herbal books were common in the medieval period, especially those tied to medicine. If the Voynich plants are disguised versions of real species, the manuscript might encode practical knowledge in a system meant to limit access. If they are imaginary, then the book may belong to a different category entirely, one in which symbolic or alchemical meaning mattered more than literal representation. The astronomical and astrological material makes the book even harder to stabilize. Some circular diagrams appear to show suns, moons, stars, or zodiac motifs. Certain folios include labels next to female figures arranged around what look like astrological wheels. Medieval manuscripts often linked medicine, calendars, astrology, and bodily processes, so the existence of such diagrams does not by itself make the Voynich manuscript impossible. But the details remain elusive. We can recognize the shape of the category without being able to read the labels that would anchor interpretation. It is like being shown a machine with familiar dials but unknown units of measurement. Historians can say this resembles astrology. They cannot say confidently what claims are being made, what calculations are embedded, or whether the diagrams map heavens, time, ritual cycles, or something stranger. Then there is the so-called biological section, one of the reasons the manuscript never feels merely academic. Pages show clusters of unclothed women, often inside pools or tubs, connected by elaborate plumbing like channels. Some scholars see these scenes as symbolic representations of bathing, fertility, bodily humors, or medicinal processes. Others think the imagery may encode cosmological or alchemical ideas. What unsettles viewers is not simply that the images are unusual. It is that they look deliberate while remaining unmoored from any standard medieval visual vocabulary most non-specialists can identify. The figures feel meaningful but not transparent. The pipes feel functional but not literally anatomical. The result is an illustration cycle that many people remember more like a dream than a text. Even if the manuscript turned out to be entirely practical, these pages would still retain an almost hallucinatory power. This blend of structure and opacity is exactly why cryptographers became obsessed with Voyniches. A truly random fake usually breaks down under statistical analysis. It reveals mechanical repetition, clumsy patterning, or lack of the kinds of distributions natural language tends to show. But the Voynich text behaves in ways that complicate easy dismissal. Scholars have noted that its word frequencies and internal regularities share some properties with natural languages, though not in a way that maps neatly onto any known one. Certain glyph groups appear in predictable positions. Some words cluster by section. Repetition exists, but not in the simplest fraudulent pattern. The script looks disciplined. It feels generated by rules. The problem is that those rules have never been translated into a convincing reading accepted by the scholarly community. That failure has a long pedigree. During the 20th century, some of the brightest codebreakers who had worked on military ciphers turned their attention to the manuscript. William Friedman, one of America's greatest cryptanalysts, spent years thinking about it. If a hidden system could be extracted, Friedman was exactly the kind of mind expected to do it. Yet even he did not produce a final decipherment that convinced the world. This matters because the Voynich manuscript is not a mystery untouched by expertise. It has survived contact with serious analytical intelligence. That does not prove it is unbreakable. It proves that simple triumph narratives do not apply. Every generation imagines it now possesses the tools that earlier generations lacked. Then the manuscript absorbs the assault and waits for the next one. Many theories have tried to explain that resistance. One of the most intuitive is that Voyniches represents a natural language written in an otherwise unknown or highly modified script. If so, the manuscript could preserve knowledge from a small community or intellectual tradition that left little other trace. This would make the book historically invaluable and also explain why it does not align with obvious Latin, German, Italian, or Hebrew models. But the theory has a major weakness. Even isolated scripts usually give way to some pattern when enough comparative material exists. With the Voynich manuscript, there is no parallel corpus, no bilingual inscription, no confirmed proper names, and no external anchor strong enough to lock interpretation. Without those anchors, any proposed language reading risks looking persuasive only to the person proposing it. A second major theory treats the text as cipher. In this view, the underlying language may be ordinary enough, but it has been concealed through substitution, transposition, abbreviation, or a more complex encoding method. This idea remains appealing because it matches the manuscript's aura of hidden knowledge. A medicinal, alchemical, or politically sensitive book might well have been encrypted to protect its contents. Yet here too the evidence cuts both ways. Some ciphers produce detectable structures that invite solution once their mechanics are guessed. The Voynich text may be too fluid for a simple substitution cipher, but too regular for pure nonsense. That has led some researchers to propose more elaborate encoding systems involving shorthand, nulls, multi-stage transforms, or compression. The problem is that the more complicated the cipher theory becomes, the easier it is for almost any observed feature to be explained after the fact. Then there is the hoax theory, perhaps the most emotionally satisfying for skeptics. Maybe the manuscript means nothing. Maybe someone in the 15th century created an unreadable but convincing artifact to deceive a wealthy buyer or patron. Medieval and early modern worlds were not innocent of forgery, and the existence of a mysterious manuscript could itself have market value. But this theory has its own burden. Creating a long, internally consistent fake on expensive vellum with section illustrations, stable script habits, and statistical properties that continue to attract serious study would have required enormous effort for uncertain reward. A hoax is possible. Yet the scale of the labor makes people ask a practical question. Why would someone devote so much disciplined time to manufacturing a book that had to remain meaningless while still imitating meaningfulness across hundreds of pages? A related but subtler theory is that the manuscript is not meaningless, but semantically thin. It may use a generated or pseudo-textual system that gives the impression of language without carrying the full weight of ordinary prose. This would make it something like a ritual object, meditative artifact, or prestige manuscript built around mystery itself. In that model, the value of the book lay not in being read line by line as information, but in being possessed, displayed, or interpreted within a restricted symbolic framework. Medieval culture certainly contained objects whose significance exceeded straightforward readability. Sacred power, rarity, and the aura of hidden wisdom often mattered as much as practical utility. The weakness of this theory is that it can become too flexible. Almost any resistant text can be labeled semi-meaningful if no one can decode it. Some researchers have attempted to identify real-world reference in the images as a path into the text. If a plant could be matched securely, then perhaps nearby labels would reveal a word. If a zodiac figure could be tied to a specific month or star sign, then a cluster of repeated terms might become interpretable. If the jars in the pharmaceutical section resemble a known medical tradition, then the book's cultural context might narrow. This image-first approach is reasonable, but it has never produced the breakthrough people hoped for. Every partial match leads to competing alternatives. A root might resemble one herb to one scholar and another to someone else. A bathing diagram might suggest medicine, alchemy, or cosmology depending on prior assumptions. The manuscript has just enough resemblance to known traditions to prevent abandonment, and just enough distortion to prevent consensus. One of the most important facts about the Voynich Manuscript is that it is not merely unread. It is socially unread. People keep announcing that they have solved it, and then the wider expert community declines to accept the claim. This cycle has repeated so often that it has become part of the manuscript's mythology. Journalists love a breakthrough. Enthusiasts love the possibility that one insight might unlock everything. But proposed decipherments almost always fail on rigor. They may explain a handful of words by stretching assumptions, ignore parts of the text that do not fit, rely on cherry-picked visual matches, or produce readings too vague to be falsifiable. Real decipherment should generate expanding clarity, not isolated poetic success. The Voynich Manuscript punishes wishful pattern recognition, and that is one reason it remains an excellent mystery rather than a solved one with loud marketing attached. Its intellectual environment may be the best place to look if a final decipherment never arrives. The early 15th century was not a simple age of disconnected superstition. It was a period of medical writing, herbal transmission, astrological practice, trade, monastic copying, courtly patronage, and regional multilingual contact. A book could combine medicine, cosmology, practical knowledge, and symbolic systems without seeming strange to its makers. The Voynich Manuscript may feel alien partly because modern categories are too rigid. We want to decide whether it is botanical, astronomical, medical, magical, or coded. The manuscript may belong to a world in which those categories overlapped more freely. That would not make it easier to read, but it would make its strange structure less impossible historically. The figure of Rudolf II often enters the story here because later tradition suggested the manuscript may have passed through his court in Prague, a place famous for collecting alchemical, scientific, artistic, and esoteric materials. The evidence for some of these ownership claims is debated, but the association matters symbolically. If the manuscript circulated through environments where hidden knowledge was prized, then its aura of secrecy may have increased long before modern scholars encountered it. A strange manuscript can acquire new layers of mystery simply by being valued as mysterious. Owners, dealers, and readers project meaning onto it. The book then survives not only because of what it is, but because each generation decides it must matter. The physical craft of the manuscript also argues against casual dismissal. The vellum had to be prepared. The quires had to be assembled. The text had to be written with remarkable consistency. The illustrations had to be planned and executed. This is labor. Focused labor. Even if the content were ultimately deceptive, the object itself is serious. That fact often gets lost because the romance of the puzzle eclipses the reality of manufacture. Someone invested real time and skill in producing this thing. That alone implies motive, whether the motive was preserving knowledge, protecting knowledge, selling mystery, or embodying a worldview we no longer recognize. The manuscript feels haunted partly because its makers worked so deliberately toward a purpose that now remains inaccessible. There is also an emotional asymmetry built into the book. It looks more solvable than it is. Human beings are good at tolerating complete obscurity when they recognize it as complete. But the Voynich Manuscript does not present as total obscurity. It teases. The pages are orderly. The script is repeatable. The sections seem thematic. The drawings imply subject matter. Everything about it says meaning is here, just beyond reach. That makes failure much harder to accept. Researchers return to the manuscript not only because they think they can solve it, but because the book seems to promise that a solution should exist. The psychology is important. The manuscript is a machine for producing almost understanding, and almost understanding is more addictive than ignorance. Modern computing has not broken the spell. Digital imaging, pattern analysis, machine learning, and corpus studies have allowed scholars to examine the manuscript with tools unthinkable to earlier generations. These tools have improved our sense of the manuscript's internal regularities, scribal habits, and structural features. They have not delivered a universally accepted translation. That result tells us something useful. The problem is not simply that older scholars lacked computational power. The real challenge lies in the absence of anchors. Without a known language base, external parallel, or confirmed semantic foothold, even powerful pattern tools can only map the shape of the forest more precisely. They still cannot name every tree. In that sense, the Voynich Manuscript is a reminder that more data do not automatically create interpretation. Some of the most interesting work around the manuscript now focuses less on grand solution and more on bounded understanding. Instead of asking what every word means, scholars ask whether different sections show different language behavior. Whether certain labels are functionally similar to captions. Whether line endings, paragraph starts, or page layouts reflect a system independent of content. Whether the manuscript may have been copied from earlier exemplars. Whether multiple hands contributed. Whether the illustrations and text were planned together or accumulated sequentially. These questions are quieter than the classic who cracked the code narrative, but they may be more scientifically honest. They accept that partial understanding is still understanding. The Voynich Manuscript may yield by degrees, if it yields at all. And then there is the possibility that it will never fully yield. This is difficult for modern culture to accept because we are trained to expect closure from puzzles. A code is broken. A case is solved. A language is translated. Yet history contains objects that outlast the interpretive technologies brought against them, not because they are supernatural, but because evidence decays unevenly. A manuscript without a context can become nearly as silent as a ruin without inscriptions. The Voynich Manuscript may be one of those cases where enough survives to fascinate, but not enough survives to finish the bridge back to its makers. That would not make it a failure of scholarship. It would make it a truthful example of how much the past can lose while still leaving behind an object dense with human intention. This is also why conspiracy theories cling to the manuscript. When a real puzzle remains unsolved for long enough, people start importing stronger causes than the evidence requires. Hidden brotherhoods. Secret sciences. Alien contact. Messages from lost civilizations. Forbidden medical knowledge the church tried to suppress. These ideas persist not because the manuscript demands them, but because ambiguity invites scale. If ordinary explanations remain uncertain, extraordinary explanations acquire emotional force. Yet the real manuscript is already extraordinary enough. A 15th century codex on real vellum, with coherent unknown writing and illustrations still resistant to stable interpretation after a century of serious study, does not need aliens to become unsettling. It only needs to remain itself. Perhaps the most honest way to think about the Voynich manuscript is as a collision between preservation and loss. The vellum survived. The ink survived. The structure survived. The images survived. The chain of ownership survived in fragments. What did not survive, at least not securely, was the key to ordinary understanding. A scribe or group of scribes once wrote these pages expecting some form of readership, even if that readership was narrow. They may never have imagined that centuries later the object would be displayed under glass while the world argued over whether it said anything at all. That distance is haunting. We are looking at a book that was made to speak, and hearing only its texture. The Voynich manuscript still matters because it exposes the limits of both certainty and dismissal. If you call it nonsense, you have to explain its disciplined complexity. If you call it a readable text, you have to explain why reading it has failed so persistently. If you call it cipher, you must show the mechanism. If you call it herbal, you must identify the plants. If you call it hoax, you must account for the labor. Every explanation pays a price. No theory walks away untouched. That is the mark of a genuine historical mystery. Not that nothing can be said, but that everything said leaves a residue of resistance behind it. So what is the Voynich manuscript really? It is a real medieval codex written on early 15th century vellum. It is organized, intentional, and visually structured like a book with purpose. It contains an unknown script that has resisted accepted decipherment. It includes botanical, astronomical, biological, and pharmaceutical style imagery that remains deeply contested. It has survived collectors, laboratories, codebreakers, and the internet without losing its central power. And that power is simple. It makes modern people confront the possibility that an object can be authentic, human, and meaningful while still refusing to be read. That is why the Voynich manuscript still haunts history. Not because it floats outside reason, but because it sits just close enough to reason to let us feel the moment where understanding should begin, and doesn't. Subscribe to Shadow Archive for more dark history documentaries.